Hi, my name's Daniel Press. I'm a partner in the law firm of Van Ness Feldman, a Washington, D.C. law firm, about 80 lawyers. I've been a partner there for 30 years. My practice has been representing Native American tribes around the country, both in Washington, advocating with Congress, helping them build their tribal governments, and when necessary, litigating. Well, it grew out of my Native American practice. After 40 some odd years doing it, when I first got out of law school, I went to work on the Navajo reservation as a legal services attorney. Spent 4 years there, then moved to Washington, and I've stayed close to a lot of friends on the Navajo reservation. I go back a lot. And after 45 years, two things happened. One, I noticed things weren't getting better on the reservation. There was still high rates of alcoholism, high rates of suicide. People I know were committing suicide. And all the wasted potential. And I had thought 40, 50 years ago that in 20 years, much less 40 years, all of these problems would start diminishing because more and more Navajos were going to college, there were better housing, things like that, but they weren't getting better, and the data verified that. Native Americans still have the highest suicide rate in the country, the highest substance abuse rate, the highest high school dropout rate, highest diabetes rate. So that was part of it. And part of it was the kinds of projects I was working on just weren't succeeding. The opportunities just seemed so ripe, and yet something kept getting in the way of it, and it frustrated me. There's something wrong here, but I couldn't figure it out. And fortunately, right about that time, I was given an opportunity to teach courses at Columbia University, undergraduate courses in Native American issues. And I had a group of 15 very, very smart young people, about 2/3 of them were Native American. And we explored the issue of what explains so much of the dysfunction, and we went through all the potential explanations. Well, it's because their constitutions were written by non-Indians, because the land situation is so screwed up. And eventually, there was consensus that the only thing that explained it was historical trauma. And fortunately, Columbia has some really excellent psychologists who were doing research on trauma. So I asked one of them to teach one of my classes, and a woman named Frances Champagne. And she talked about the research she was doing with mice and showing the historical trauma being passed from generation to generation. So I got interested. The thing that really sent me over the top or made me drink the Kool-Aid, my wife just knew I was interested in historical trauma, and she found an article and she emailed to me about something called the Adverse Childhood Experience Study. I had not known about that, even though we were talking about historical trauma. And I looked at that and I said, that wasn't done in San Diego, that was done on the Navajo reservation. I mean, the kinds of outcomes, high rates of suicide, high rates of substance abuse, high rate. And for the first time, the question that I'd been wrestling with all those years of what explains all of the problems on reservations and why they aren't getting better is adverse childhood experiences and historical trauma. So I became friends with a Native American psychologist named Tammy Dakota, who I think is on the CTIPP board. She had an employment problem with the Indian Health Service because she was a little too innovative in trying to do trauma-informed work. So I had to represent her in an employment dispute. And she started teaching me more and more about trauma. And then one day she called me and said, Dan, I never mentioned to you, but I used to babysit for Senator Heitkamp, the senator from North Dakota. And she just called me up and said she wants to meet me for coffee to find out what's going on in Indian country. What should I ask her for? I said, ask her to put together a round table in the Senate on the causes and effects of trauma in Native American communities. And so Tammy asked her, and Heitkamp, who's always one of the great children's advocates, said, okay, and she called her staff back in Washington and said, put on a roundtable. And her staff called me and said, Dan, we got to put on a roundtable on trauma. We don't know anything about it. Put on a roundtable. So Tammy and I got to arrange the roundtable. We had a wonderful research psychologist from Johns Hopkins talk about the physiology. He had done some research showing that he could predict who had attempted suicide just from studying the cortisol in their bloodstream. His name's Zach Kaminsky. We had Tammy talking about the biology of historical trauma. We had Elizabeth Pruitt talking about the ACE study. And then we had somebody from the Menominee tribe talking about the innovative program they had there to implement trauma-informed programs. And Senator Heitkamp, unusual for a Senate, actually sat there for over an hour. And as she said finally, it was a 3-hour roundtable. As she was walking out, she said, I have been to many meetings here in the Senate on Native American affairs. This is the first time I've ever walked out feeling optimistic. And she became the great advocate for trauma. She used to laugh that other senators would avoid her in the hallways because they knew she'd grab them and start talking about trauma. And so after that roundtable, Tammy and a couple of other people, some from Alaska, created an organization to continue the momentum that was developed at the roundtable, and particularly teach other tribes about trauma, ACEs, and particularly the model that the Menominee had developed. And I gave it the ungainly name of the Roundtable on Native American Trauma-Informed Initiatives. It's a mouthful. And one of the women who joined the group was a researcher at NIH, a Native American researcher whose name is just slipping right now. But she was asked to speak at a forum of federal employees that Andy Blanche was responsible for coordinating on bringing federal employees together from different agencies to talk about trauma. So I went and sat in and listened to her. And after she was done, it was the end of the forum, I went up to visit with her at the front of the room. And she was talking to 2 other people, and we explained my role in the creation of the roundtable. And Andy was one of them. I can't remember who was the other one. Said, we've been thinking about creating some kind of national organization on trauma. I said, you really need one, because when I first discovered this issue and I went online looking for people to help me, there was nobody there. There was no organization I could turn to, and there are a million organizations in Washington, yet there's none on this. So I said, why haven't you done it? And she said, good question. And she said, well, we don't have a room to bring everyone together. So I said, I have a big conference room in my law firm. You're welcome to have it. Let's have a meeting. And a month later, Sandy Bloom and Andy and 25 other people gathered in my conference room and created the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice. And right about that time, I was phasing down my law practice. I didn't need to keep working. I could have retired. But I now had something else that was driving me. And so I started spending more and more time on the work I was doing for the Roundtable and the work I was doing for CTIPP. Until now, it's 100% of my time is devoted. And a lot of it is working with Congress. When CTIPP was first created 3 years ago, you'd go up to the Hill and say ACEs, and people would think you were talking about Las Vegas. There was no knowledge. And then just over the last couple of years, partially because of the work CTIPP did, partially because of the work Heidi Heitkamp did and the forums she put on. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was up meeting with people in the House of Representatives prior to a hearing I'll talk about. We were going from office to office, encourage them to sit in on this hearing on trauma. Every staff aide I talked to knew about trauma, knew about ACE study. It hasn't all permeated to the top yet. The congressmen, senators are still kind of weak on it, but having the aides know about it is really important. So we've been trying to pursue legislation to infuse trauma-informed concepts into federal programs. And it's been slow going. The big breakthrough just occurred a month ago, well, 3 weeks ago. Congressman Cummings from Baltimore realized the importance of trauma and ACEs to his constituents in Baltimore and hired a staff person he said, I want to educate my committee, which is the Committee on Oversight and Reform, a very powerful committee on trauma, and then I want to develop major legislation. And the staff person was a terrific guy. He only had two problems. One, he didn't know anything about trauma, and he didn't know anything about the Hill. And Christy Bethel introduced me to him, and I began helping him. So ended up, he brought lots of other people in to help him too. There's now actually a coalition in Washington of about 20 different nonprofit organizations that are advocating for trauma-informed legislation, the YMCA, Futures Without Violence, the American Academy of Pediatrics, on and on. So it's CTIPP is now part of a much larger coalition. We're no longer the ones out there doing it by ourselves. And so the hearing was July 11th, and the first panel, 4 survivors, trauma survivors, including a member of CTIPP board of directors who had seen his mother killed right in front of him. We had a vet who had suffered trauma as a kid and then got it magnified by being in Iraq. We had a woman who was at one of the school shootings, and a woman who was sexually abused. And each one of them is now running a program to help other victims. And they all talked about their experience very frankly, and not the kind of thing that happens in Congress, where people talk really emotionally about what's going on. And when they were finished, Congressman Cummings thanked them and dismissed the panel. And as they were getting up, every member of the committee stood up and applauded. And that has never happened in anybody's memory in Congress. And there were Republicans and Democrats. We had members of the Freedom Caucus in the room. We had members of the Squad, AOC, and the women that Trump's been picking up. Every one of them was in sync on realizing they had just heard something really significant. And then there was a second panel with experts like Christy Bethel and somebody from the state of Tennessee, which is one of the trauma-informed states, Jim Henry, who was the deputy governor and in charge of the initiative, and somebody from the Center for Disease Control, who was just great, talking about their commitment to trauma. So they opened it up for questioning, and the questioning went on for 2 hours. And again, something I've never seen. And you could not tell from listening to the questions who was a Democrat and who was a Republican. It was a nonpartisan issue. So the challenge now is to develop legislation that can pass the Congress. So that's a whole bunch of us are working on that now. So that's exciting. So we've made a lot of progress getting Congress start becoming aware of how important trauma is for the programs they operate. And then the roundtable has gone through a transition. We started having these monthly calls where I have different people. I think Diane Wagenholt did one presentation and others on issues of programs that were successful. And it started losing steam. And the Native Americans who were involved in it said, trauma is really not a Native American term. There's no term for it in our language. There's something else really going on here. And they came up with the concept of reigniting the warrior spirit. That what really, ACEs are a problem, but ACEs aren't the root cause. The root cause is, if the question for trauma is what happened to you, what happened to Native Americans was the colonialism and destruction of their world. And that's what we really have to grapple with. So The organization is in the process of changing its name to Reigniting the Warrior Spirit. We've had a series of conferences around the country, one in Arizona, one in San Diego, or right outside of San Diego on a reservation, and the last one on the Navajo Reservation, educating the community about trauma, and then bringing together the school system and the healthcare system and the social services system and the justice system on the belief that trauma is so thick on reservations that only a comprehensive integrated approach will make a difference. And so little by little, we're trying and helping, encouraging communities to come together and create trauma-informed tribal communities. I drafted a how-to handbook on how to develop a comprehensive tribal community. And through the conferences and the monthly calls, we're starting to get through. It's a slow process, in part because the communities are so traumatized. But for the first time, again, going back to where I started, for the first time in my career, I really have a feeling of hope and optimism that we now understand what created the problems on reservations. It's what happened to them. And there's a solution, there's a pathway out of it, thanks to what we all know about trauma. As the Pro Bono General Counsel for CTIPP, I have two roles. One is to deal with any legal issues that come up, but there aren't that many. But my main role is head of the policy committee for CTIPP. And one of the things I discovered early on was we have these phenomenal local trauma-informed programs going on all over the country. And I asked the people working them, have you ever shared what you're doing with your senators and congressmen? For example, Tennessee just is phenomenal. They are creating the first trauma-informed state. And I said, have you ever briefed Senator Alexander? He's chairman of the Health, Education, Labor, Pensions Committee, through which every piece of legislation that would touch trauma would go through. You know, we never thought of that. And I heard that over and over again, and I realized there was a disconnect. It was kind of sobering to think that the rest of the country doesn't spend all their time thinking about Washington the way those of us who live there do. But I realized there needed to be some kind of vehicle to encourage local constituencies to talk to their senators and congressmen, educate them about trauma, and let them know the great stuff that's going on, because the most effective lobbyists are voters in that district. They walk in and they get much more attention than even I would going in. So created something called CTIPP Community Advocacy Network, a CTIPP CAN, one of my few creative namings. And once a month, we have an hour-and-a-half phone call with participants from all over the country, from local trauma-informed groups, state trauma-informed groups, every once in a while some other Washington organizations. And I spend the first 15, 20 minutes briefing people on what's going on in Washington, what the latest is on different pieces of trauma legislation or about the Cummings hearing. And then we have speakers talking about what they're doing in their local communities, sharing it with the others on the phone. And that has just been an extraordinary experience to hear what great things are going on. And I think it's been extraordinary for the people listening. Our July call, we had an Associate Justice of the Mississippi Supreme Court talking about how she is working to make the entire Mississippi court system trauma-informed. I think everybody on the phone had their mouth open. The Mississippi, and we now talked about there are a couple of other Supreme Court justices, state Supreme Court justices, and I'd like to create a CTIPP committee of Supreme Court justices to advocate with their brethren, because they carry so much weight. The Tennessee Chief Justice is also a great advocate. So CTIPP CAN has become a vehicle for me to educate local communities about how to trauma. CTIPP has put together several different documents on how local communities can advocate and do so without risking their 501c3 status. And it's working. More and more of these local groups are reaching out to the local office of their senators and congressmen, or coming to Washington and educating and advocating with their congressmen and senators. And it's starting to make a difference. And what's amazing is it is not a partisan issue. Several of the most powerful senators for what we're interested in are from two red states that also have some of the most powerful, some of the most effective and trauma-informed programs, Tennessee and Missouri. The senator from Missouri, Senator Blunt, chairs the Appropriations Subcommittee that appropriates money for health, education, and labor. And Tennessee, as I mentioned, Senator Alexander chairs the Health Committee. We're fortunate both those states have very vibrant trauma-informed programs, and they are working now closely with the staffs of those two senators to get them on board about trauma. And it's starting to spread around the country. Here in Pennsylvania, people from Lakeside met with staff of Senator Casey, and Senator Durbin and Senator Capito, Congressman, or Senator from Illinois, who's Democrat, and Capito, a Republican from West Virginia, have introduced trauma-informed legislation. And at the meetings with Toomey and Casey, the Lakeside people encouraged them to Casey's office, particularly because he's on the Health Committee, to become a co-sponsor. So the word is getting out there. To me, there are so many trauma-informed programs around the country. Every time I turn around, I find a new one. Everybody is drinking the Kool-Aid on it, and it has the potential to be an enormously potent lobbying force. I mean, my vision is that what happens for trauma is what happened for AIDS, what happened for smoking, what happened for opioids, that the way things really get done in Washington, besides playing around the edges, is when there's such a groundswell from the grassroots that Congress has no choice but to act. And to me, trauma is the kind of issue that has the potential, because it touches everything and has the ability to change everything. And so my vision is, some point, all of those different local programs, the hundreds of thousands of them, all come together and sing off the same song sheet, and it's heard in Washington. And hopefully CTIPP will be one of the leaders in making that happen, because it's really the only organization out there that's sole purpose is to promote trauma-informed programs. So I had mentioned earlier, I'm doing this work on a pro bono basis. I'm really fortunate my law firm is supporting me. But it reflects CTIPP's one big gap. CTIPP is an all-volunteer organization, and we've got some really phenomenal people, but they all have other jobs, and we really suffer from the lack of full-time staff. You can't change the world the way we're trying to do it on strictly volunteer labor. So we need people to donate to CTIPP. Go on the CTIPP website, you'll find out how to do that. You'll also find out how to join the CTIPP CAN calls, which are once a month, the third Wednesday of a month, 2 to 3:30 Eastern Time. But we need your contributions, we need your time and effort. If we're going to create a grassroots movement, it's going to require everybody to do it. If you're not part of the movement, then you're sitting on your hands, and the changes I'm sure you want to see happen in the country, in your community, they're just not going to happen. Everybody's got to step up. So I encourage everybody who hears this to become part of CTIPP, become part of local advocacy groups. We can create that groundswell, but it can't happen unless everybody starts getting involved. If you don't volunteer, then there's not going to be anybody volunteering.